Well, hello. Hi, everyone. My name is Mark Graban. Thank you for joining me here today on the webinar. I'm really excited to be able to share some thoughts on change management in the context of lean, and also to talk about a really interesting and exciting change management simulation from a company called ExperiencePoint. I first got introduced to ExperiencePoint and their ExperienceChange simulation called Lakeview about 5 or 6 years ago. And I learned a lot from being able to participate in the simulation as a workshop participant. Really made me think about change management. And finally, I don't know what took me so long, but I'm really happy now that I'm officially trained as a facilitator to bring this workshop to my clients, to different organizations, either as a standalone activity or something that's part of a broader engagement to work together on lean and continuous improvement. So I want to talk about the agenda for the time we have here today. I want to share some thoughts first, some of my own experiences and some of the thoughts from the experts and thought leaders at ExperiencePoint about change management, some of my thoughts and reflections on how that ties in to our attempts to practice lean or to use lean to transform an organization. And then I'm going to talk about how the ExperienceChange workshop is usually structured and facilitated. So it is built around a very engaging web-based simulation, but people work together in teams to work on this simulation. So it's not a person and the computer, it's a team of people working together, learning and discussing and practicing the change principles that we are working on in the workshop. So I want to talk about the structure of the workshop and then do a demonstration and actually show you what the simulation looks like. Because I know for me, when I first saw it, that is what really solidified in my mind that this is a powerful way of to learn by doing, and to do so in a safe environment of a workshop and a simulation. And so I think you kind of have to see it to really understand how this could be really powerful and interesting, I hope, for you and your organization. So let me start off with a number here, 70%. And some of you who have read the literature on change management may recognize this number. This number comes from a study, John Kotter of the book Leading Change. He's very well known for that. In '96, Professor Kotter published evidence or research that says 70% of large-scale change programs didn't meet their goals. And we hear similar talk in the lean community about the rate of failure, if you will, failure of lean initiatives. And when Kotter talks about large-scale change programs, we're not just talking about programs like Lean or Six Sigma, or trying to think back to why did TQM, Total Quality Management, maybe not take root or stick in different organizations. We can take a look at large-scale changes like adopting an EMR system or merging two health systems into an integrated organization. There are all sorts of really complex, risky, large-scale change programs that generally don't meet their goals. Now, I think there's two sides to this equation. One could be the goals were too ambitious, and therefore we didn't meet those goals. But even let's say if the goals are realistic, a lot of organizations underperform and they struggle, and they try to figure out how we can have these large-scale change programs like a lean transformation, a lean culture change, and have that be more successful. I hear a lot of organizations, especially in the context of lean, sort of lament and talk about the idea of lack of sustainment. So, we are making changes happen and we backslide. We go back to the old way of doing things. And sadly, in some organizations, lean either fades away or we see sustainment problems at another scale. So we hear the talk of lack of sustainment in relation to rapid improvement events, RPIWs, Kaizen events. We do a project and then an organization slides back into the old way of doing things. Even some of the leading lean health systems that have been doing this for more than a decade have previously published and shared their experiences with backsliding rates that were greater than 50%. And so we think, well, it's a waste to go back and repeat an event, to re-implement a change or to solve a problem again when we thought we had solved it that first time. That's a problem with events. And again, it's also a problem at a larger scale with our lean transformation. Why do we have a lack of sustainment? And as lean thinkers, hopefully, we're asking why. We're not just lecturing or haranguing people or labeling them as resistant to change or labeling them as bad people. We need to understand why practices aren't taking root. I think a lot of times what people describe as a lack of sustainment is often really a lack of adoption. We look at a typical rapid improvement event cycle. We form a team, we look at a current state. Hopefully we understand some underlying causes. We develop some countermeasures. We test them. We create some new standardized work and procedures. And sometimes the team says, okay, hey, yeah, we're done. We project a 70% improvement in some measure. We've implemented it. Here we go. Everyone follow this process. And when people come back 60 or 90 days later and they see, oh, people are doing it the old way. And they often think, well, they've gone back to the old way of doing it. I think a lot of times it was really never adopted to begin with, beyond the context of the event. So that what seems like lack of sustainment might really be more a lack of adoption or a lack of buy-in. And I hear this phrase a lot, and I've thought about it a lot over the years. And I've sort of come to at least maybe pose a question here. By the time many people complain about a lack of buy-in, maybe that's too late to be getting buy-in. We see organizations talking about the new process that comes out of a rapid improvement event. They may talk about lean very broadly, and the organization is pushing a solution and then noticing or complaining or lamenting that people aren't buying into our solution. And then we're trying to figure out, how do we get them to buy in? And again, I think that's something that needs to be addressed further upstream, not just when we are trying to push a solution. We need to engage people. And so if we ask, well, why is there a lack of buy-in? I think a lot of it comes down to, we could say, a lack of engagement. And it's not a lack of engagement in that solution implementation phase. I think we often have a lack of engagement in the early upfront stage of any change cycle. If we ask, why are we trying to embrace lean? Why are we doing that rapid improvement event? Why are we implementing a new EMR system? We need to engage with people in the earliest stages of that change process, which helps people buy in because they're participating, which reduces the lack of buy-in problem. And I think that also then helps head off the lack of sustainment problem. So we hear sometimes, if we ask, why do we not sustain change? Why are people not implementing change? It's really easy to throw around this, this phrase. I hear it a lot. Well, people hate change. I think, well, again, we're labeling people as being resistant. We're implying the problem is with them. I love this quote from Peter Schultes. People don't resist change, they resist being changed. And I think there's a very powerful distinction here. It's not just a cute play on words. I've often said, it's not that people hate change. It's people hate being told what to do. People they hate being forced to do something that they don't agree with, or that they don't understand, or that they haven't helped create. So if we look at things more in the realm of psychology, and we think, well, how do we help get people to a point where they are choosing to change? I've been doing a lot of reading, and I actually blogged about this yesterday, about psychology and counseling, and trying to get people to choose to embrace new behaviors. We could think of that in terms of choosing to exercise more, or choosing to embrace lean leadership styles. And I think what the evidence and practice in the field of therapy shows is that you can't tell someone to change. And you certainly can't force them to change. You can have discussions where they articulate why it's important to change and what steps they're going to take to move along in that process. Now, people might say, well, I don't have time for that, to have those conversations. But at the same time, I don't think we have time for failed change initiatives either. So we need to engage people. And engagement is very much an active verb. It's not something that happens. I hear people in hospitals complain about, oh, we have a low level of physician engagement with lean. So, well, I like to ask, what are you doing to engage them? Engagement means you're reaching out, you're talking to them, you're working with them. You're not asking them to just roll over or buy in or go along with your solution or your reason for change. We need to engage them in understanding reasons for change. So if we involve people early, that makes a huge difference in helping understand the circumstances and the problems and the case for change before we ever talk about the actual change. So we can help people understand and articulate why change is necessary before we even go and dig deeper into defining the problem more specifically or talking about solutions. We can help people define the problem statement. I've gone through this exercise with teams in different departments and projects. And instead of management telling them what the problem is, people who do the work, who work in areas, usually if you ask them and facilitate some discussion, they'll be able to articulate the case for change for the patients, for themselves, for the organization, safety, quality, cost. Understand their motivations, and then let people participate in the process instead of trying to force buy-in for your change. And so I think of lean projects that I've done with teams back when I was at Johnson & Johnson 10 years ago. We were following a pretty specific change model that I have a far better appreciation for now. A change model that was less about telling people what to do and more about forming a team, engaging people, the people who do the actual work, and getting them to participate in the change process. So it was very powerful. And our project success rate within that team I was a part of at Johnson & Johnson, our success rate was very high. And it was because organizations helped dedicate staff time into understanding the need for change and going through a great change process. So I think, as I'm an engineer by background, and say half in jest, being a recovering engineer, engineering, I think, taught you to find the answer and place such a high value on having the right answer. But effective leaders of change know not just what to do, but how to be as a leader. Having the right answer, and I've learned this lesson through mistakes I've made in my career. Having the right answer means nothing if other people don't also understand the problem and the circumstances and the solution. And the best way, again, to get people to really understand and own something is to have them participating. So we need to not look, just at the world from the lens of a project plan, doing the right things at the right time, done well. But we also need to think about the human side, the emotional side of how to be as leaders, how to be human-centered, how to have a learning organization, kind of learn it all, figure it out mindset, as opposed to a know-it-all, execute the plan mindset. So we need not just tasks, but we also need relationships. And I think, lean thinkers in the audience hopefully would recognize this idea. It's not just about what we do, but it's about how we act. What are our behaviors and philosophies and mindsets? And the ExperienceChange model and the workshop gives people a chance to practice both sides of this equation in a very interactive way. That's one reason I've been so drawn to this. So we can think about a change over time. We're trying to create some sort of impact, whether we're trying to improve quality, productivity, employee morale, whatever sort of measure. And we often think, well, we've got some rate of performance, we're going to introduce some change, we're facing some challenge, and we expect performance to get better. We have a good idea, we will implement that idea, things will get better. And if they don't, we'll fall back and blame people for not buying in. But what's very realistic in the real world, what actually happens is to see some sort of dip. Gambrill and Stevens would call this a natural cocoon phase of a project, because change, even positive change, can be disruptive. And we might expect and naturally see a dip in performance. We might see a dip in staff morale because people are uncomfortable, even if we're engaging them and working with them. Change is hard. People get scared. That's part of human nature. So we need to work through that and try to lead people out of that cocoon phase into more positive territory. And we need to almost expect that a dip like this is natural if we are taking on any sort of large-scale change. So we can say, well, why does this occur? What is this dip? The Kubler-Ross change model can be helpful, not just thinking about personal grief, but thinking about in the workplace, different stages people go through. Denial, resistance, they're disoriented. Maybe they start to finally come around, they start experimenting, and then they start finding some commitment to change. So good change management practices are meant not necessarily to completely eliminate that dip, but to moderate the dip. How do we minimize the amount of resistance and disorientation? How do we minimize the trough in morale or performance? And how do we accelerate getting out of that trough more quickly? And good change management practices can help get us there. And that's what this workshop is meant to help people explore. So people who know not just what to do, but how to act can moderate that dip and achieve the impact earlier. Now, this is something I've been teaching, or we had a model back at J&J that I incorporated even to the first edition of my book, Lean Hospitals, back in 2008. That the standard model is to have you expect some sort of dip in performance. It's not just staff morale; it might be turnaround times in a lab. We're experimenting with a new process. We're training people. We're bringing them along. They're not comfortable with the new approach. They're not up the learning curve yet. Turnaround times may temporarily get worse. Now, as leaders, I think it's important to not panic and give up on the new process, but to sort of, ride that out, come up the learning curve, continue training and coaching and communicating and continuously improving. But I think, what we found in our J&J projects, by having a good model of engaging people early on, we moderated and minimized the impact of that dip. And another reason I feel so drawn to the experience point methodology here is that the change model we used at J&J was almost exactly what Experience Point and their thought leaders have kind of proposed as a model for change that we teach and utilize within the workshop. It's a variation of a well-known model that comes from John Kotter. I agree with the modification to the model, and I'll sort of point out that key distinction in a minute here. But we can think about high-level, large-scale change initiatives as a 7-step process, right? So as lean thinkers, we should be comfortable saying, okay, we can actually turn this into a framework. We can have a process. This doesn't mean it becomes a cookbook or that it becomes easy, but having a mental model to organize our thoughts and progress over time can be very powerful. And this model starts with the first couple of steps are focused on kind of forming a core change team, thinking about the why and the who and the what. So before we engage the entire organization, and this is where the Kotter change model would have started with trying to create a sense of urgency across the entire organization. That can be dangerous, that can be risky. If we talk about a burning platform and we get people all riled up without talking about our plan to address it, we may just panic and scare people. So, we're not trying to hide that from them, but there's a lot of wisdom in getting started with a project champion and a core team. First, understanding the need for change. So this is, I think, good lean problem solving. We're not starting with what are we going to implement. We're talking about what problem are we trying to solve, and define that and understand that. And then enlist a core change team. We did this in our J&J projects. We would have a team of 4 to 6 frontline staff from different roles. And they weren't the only ones who got input. They were just the lead full-time people on these different lean implementation efforts. And so that core change team can go and continue understanding the problem, talking to others, understanding the current state, putting together at least a hypothesis and a plan around a vision and strategy. That's step 3, the envisage stage. And then we start looking from that small group to the whole of the organization. Now we start communicating and engaging with the broader set of employees. We communicate the vision. We start taking action to move things forward. And then as we make gains, we take steps to reinforce and consolidate those gains. So we can think of this in the context of not just a linear flow, but we can think of it as a PDSA, plan, do, study, adjust model that defines the problem, comes up with countermeasures, tests those countermeasures, studies, and adjusts accordingly. So we move down the path from why, who, and what in a core team, and then we kind of, in a way, repeat but expand what we're doing in the organization to the why, the how, and the what. And what I see in a lot of organizations, I think part of the struggles with lean and buy-in is that people are jumping into step 6, they're jumping into action. Or they may do a little bit of communication and they think, yeah, we've communicated, but that's always in the ear of the beholder. If there's been enough communication, that's one of John Cotter's key 8 points about why changes fail. People underestimate the need for communication, the amount of communication. So again, in the workshop, in the simulation, we explore a model like this, or we can talk about it in the context of change models your organization might already have, and get some practice in a safe setting. And that's what the workshop is about. We're trying to build a solid foundation for change. As Cotter says, the change process goes through a series of stages that in total usually require a considerable length of time. Skipping stages, those upfront stages, creates only the illusion of speed and never produces a satisfying result. So to me, this makes me think of lean thinking and the idea of go slow to go fast. We might say, we don't have time to fully engage people in that way. But again, I would ask, do we have time to have large-scale change initiatives that fail? So let's talk about the workshop. And the people at Experience Point, under the banner of this ExperienceChange model, they have 2 different simulations. One is called Lakeview, which is based around a hospital emergency department, a hospital that's trying to improve patient flow. There's also a model that we can facilitate called Global Tech, which is based around a high-tech manufacturing for-profit company. But today, we're going to be talking about Lakeview because my clients primarily are in healthcare, and this is a model that was developed specifically for people in healthcare organizations. About Experience Point, you can learn more about them at experiencepoint.com. They are all about experiential learning by doing. They're different products. Their learning simulations have been used in over 2/3 of the top executive education programs. They've been facilitated on all continents, and they had over 50,000 participants in 2014. A really good team of people at Experience Point, and you can learn more again at their website. But ExperienceChange in general, it's a simulation that helps people practice leading change, to engage with the types of behaviors and skill sets that can make change happen. And this is done in a very fun, engaging, interactive way. Again, even though this is computer-based, This is something that we would typically do in conference rooms and meeting rooms on site, as you see these pictures illustrating. This is teams of people working together. And so in this Lakeview simulation, you play the role of a VP of patient services. And you have a challenge of reducing wait times in the emergency department and increasing patient satisfaction by implementing lean practices. And the goal is to build stakeholder commitment and achieve a particular rate of buy-in. As you'll see, that gets measured in the simulation. This is not a simulation about, quote unquote, how to implement lean, but it's about that higher level, broad scale change management process. So in the process and some of the outcomes, we want people to learn a change model that can be brought back to the workplace, to speak and act with a common language and a shared confidence for change. When teams of people in an organization, if they're about to go do a big project, practicing and developing these skills and terminology through the Lakeview simulation can be very helpful as they move forward and develop their plans in the real world. Learn how to align and engage stakeholders, build a highly engaged culture of execution. And these workshops are typically done in the context of leadership development classes, change readiness programs, before a major lean initiative or a major project, or as part of general leadership management curriculum. So the typical agenda, when I've been able to facilitate this at organizations, is basically a day-long workshop. Most of it, you see the blue, those are the blocks of time where teams of 3 to 4 people are working together in their teams, discussing, looking at the case, going through the execution of the simulation. We start off, the yellow phase talks about, we do introductions, we talk a little bit about change management and our struggles and our own case for change around change management. We analyze the case, and I'll show you what this looks like. Then we come back and talk about the case, talk a little bit more about change theory. And then the teams jump back in and plan what they're going to do in their case scenario. They work on implementing the plan in this very interactive simulation format. And then we get back together as a group and we debrief for an hour or two. We talk about lessons learned, what are we going to do moving forward. This is really, again, a very hands-on, engaged, interactive format to learn by doing instead of learning by being lectured to about change. So again, there's a introductory session that might look like this. And then we'll form our teams and dive into the case study. There's some pre-reading that teams can go through that introduces the scenario that we work on in the simulation. Here's a team of some people. I facilitated this in September. They're working together with the simulation. They're talking with each other. That dynamic is so powerful instead of individuals just sitting and playing the simulation on their own. So we would go through and review the case. We go into the simulation and interview stakeholders. So we're teaching the idea of stakeholder analysis. We're taking notes, and we're trying to identify driving forces for change and restraining forces. You can call this a force field analysis. So I'm going to jump into the simulation. And when we do the workshop, participants get access to the simulation a week in advance so that they can come through and read the case within the software. We use it together in the workshop, and then each individual actually has access to it for a full year so that they can come back and revisit the simulation. They can come and try again based on additional learning and experience they have with change management in the real workplace. So again, this is web-based, and you get access to this by bringing the workshop to your organization. Each team would log in. They've probably read through the case in advance. This is a case that was built on real situations in Ontario, looking at the needs they had to improve emergency department patient flow. These are very universal scenarios. So this is by no means just a Canadian case study. This is a healthcare case study. So as we go through and see the main screen here, as a team, we see all of our different stakeholders. Now, in general, in this case scenario that we're going to be executing, we have 40 weeks of time. We have $150,000 of budget, and we can see we're currently starting off with the buy-in rate of 5%. We can see our different individuals, and we can see their current buy-in level, how much our last change tactic either helped or hurt their level of buy-in. So you can see, for example, Charlotte, the CEO. As a team, we might want to prioritize who we're talking to and what we're going to ask them about. So here we see Charlotte. We can ask her about the challenges, and you can read this on screen. I'm going to see, I don't know how well the audio will come through in the webinar, but if we ask Charlotte about the challenges they're facing.
It will be very hard to get buy-in for this project, especially if it's perceived as a way of speeding patients out the door before they're ready.
So hopefully, you at least just kind of get a sense there. It's not just the reading on screen, but it's the opportunity to hear a bit of the inflection in the different stakeholders' voices. What do they think about the problem? What do they think about potential solutions? So as a team, that group is trying to decide, okay, well, who do we talk to next? We might just, we might need to use our time more wisely instead of just, going from person to person and reading every single thing. You can see we've got different physicians, nurse managers, union shop steward, lab manager, patients, ambulance services. There's a journalist, a social worker. As a team, we go through and we're kind of understanding different people's perspectives. Who's excited about this? Who thinks lean is just a buzzword? Who thinks they already have a solution? Everyone I've seen kind of go through this case says that the different roles and perspectives that people have here are very realistic and not in a stereotypical way of who opposes change or not. But it's just this really reflects what you generally have in an organization. And I think there's a great lesson here in the practice of stakeholder analysis. Instead of jumping the solutions, instead of jumping to implement things. So again, the team will go through and do that stakeholder analysis, and then we'll come back and talk about the case. We'll talk a little bit more about change theory. Again, this is a very facilitated discussion. We can talk about and actually go through and do a force field analysis. What are the factors that are leading people to want to change? What are the things that are getting in the way? And this is both, again, sort of the two different sides of the brain, not just the rational case for change, but the emotional case for change, or the things that might get in the way of change. So we'll talk about, again, this formal 7-step change model and think about how this can be useful in deciding what we do as the VP of Patient Services. So we move into the next phase. You see a picture of a team here kind of going through the planning and implementation phase. So even though this is computer-based, teams have cards that have the different tactics that they can implement in this case, 40 weeks, $150,000. So we can go into a list of tactics that you see here within the screen. People can learn about those tactics. Oops, I'm jumping into implementing. There you go. If you click on it, you can read more about the approach. You could say, look, let's start with 5S. People say you always start with 5S. You might decide to do that. You could go through and do further interviews. You could define ED data requirements. Each of these different tactics have a time and a cost associated with them. So I think it's a good practice here, not to just not to dive in and start doing stuff, but to kind of try to put together a plan. And that's where people either use those cards to organize and look physically, and then maybe build a plan in the simulation. So again, in these teams, you're trying to think about and debate and argue and discuss, why are we going to do certain tactics, which again is far more complex than an individual just looking and deciding what are you going to do. This is a really interesting part of the discussion. You can start to see what sort of team dynamics that you have within your team if people have come to this workshop as part of the preparation for a real life change initiative. So there are all these different tactics that you can consider and think about. What would you do first? What do you do in the early stages of the change model? What do you do later? how much budget do you have, make sure you're not going to run out of time. The team puts together that plan. And then they go through and start executing the plan. So we're going to do just a little mini version here within the webinar. If you look in the control panel, I've launched a poll. Hopefully you see something here that says quick poll. And there's 4 different tactics that we are going to try here. One could be, map out where people stand. Look at the different stakeholders to identify their support and resistance, understand their initial perceptions of change. That would take half a week and cost $3,000. Or number 2, we could send the chief of staff to go open up general medicine beds. When there's a backlog of patients stacked up in the emergency department, send the chief of staff out in the general medicine to review patients for discharge, dive in and take action. 3, we could announce a project, identify the VP as the project lead. Or 4, we could ask the CEO to give an encouraging speech, to work harder. That change is possible if everyone just pulls together and tries a little harder. So I would ask you, go ahead and take that quick poll. We'll see if there's some sort of consensus within the group of webinar attendees here. See some votes coming in. Okay. We've got 42% of you have voted. This is pretty cool. This is the first time I've done a poll like this in a webinar. All right, so looks like we've got pretty strong consensus. 63% say, let's map out where people stand. So thank you for doing that. So we're going to go within the simulation, and this is what we would be doing in the workshop, map out where people stand. Now this plus means that we need to dive a little bit deeper. And so based on our stakeholder analysis, we are going to, again, you think, well, what is the value of labels? But if, in a broad brush, decide who do we think is either a champion, a helper, a bystander, or an active resistor. So the team working on this together in the workshop, based on their stakeholder analysis, is going to identify, I'm just sort of randomly clicking on people. But this would take some amount of time to say, well, these people have expressed real concerns about this initiative. Here are people that are kind of indifferent and they're off to the side, and who we think is actually a helper. And then later on, as part of our feedback of how we perform as a team, we'll get feedback about whether the stakeholder analysis seemed correct or not. So we go and implement that step. And we get some feedback from our change coach who says, stakeholder mapping is an important first step. You've correctly identified that most people are bystanders. And then what happens here is you can see we had a +3. Our overall project buy-in score has gone from 5% to 8%. And in the course of a full workshop, our goal is to try to get 60% project buy-in. That's a meaningful tipping point for an entire organization. And we can see even individually, looks like, okay, everyone for the most part is happy that we did that stakeholder analysis. I'm going to go through and choose a second tactic now without the polling. So let's see what happens if we announce a project. So as our team, we're going to go through and look at our tactics. And say, okay, we're going to announce the project. We'll implement that tactic as a team. The decision's been saved. And we say, +2. The announcement of the project has generated a buzz, and several people have volunteered to help. So for each step we implement, we get feedback from the change coach. We can see who is doing better or not within the organization. Now, if we implement some tactics that are maybe either at the wrong timing or maybe just incorrect, we may have some problems that occur. So let's do the CEO speech. This is a popular tactic in the real world. Let's do a speech to work harder. So we'll say, yes, let's implement that step. We see -1. The speech to work harder has gone over like a lead balloon. This can backfire. So we're getting that feedback. So as a team, we've put together our plan. we're implementing steps, but now we may learn and have to adjust. So this team dynamic, again, that team sitting at a table in front of or around a computer, it's a really interesting dynamic to see, well, maybe you had disagreement and you went ahead with somebody's step and it turned out to cause a problem. How does the team react? How do you recover from that? How do you move forward? So there's this iteration of putting together the plan, implementing different tactics, and looking to see the simulation has logic to determine whether these steps are going to be effective or not. And again, this is not just, I think, kind of random amount of feedback. It's based on that change model that we've taught and started understanding and started putting in place. If you follow the steps of that 7-step high-level change model, you'll be more effective than a team that, for example, jumps into action more quickly without engaging people early on in the process. So the teams will go through and play out the simulation. They'll either succeed or struggle. Each team has a percentage buy-in score. The more important thing than the score is debriefing and reflecting on what we learned in the process. What did we learn about change? What did we learn about our team dynamics? What worked well? What didn't work well? So you see, there could be a lot of high fives. I've seen teams, unfortunately, they get kind of frustrated because they thought they were doing things that would have been helpful, but it wasn't working. So each team gets the opportunity to debrief. And again, you have access to this after the workshop to see a team's progress. So here's a team that succeeded and hit 61% company buy-in along the way. You also get more detailed feedback, whether the team succeeded or not, that tells you, will help people interpret these bars. Were steps done at the right phase or not? So, here's an example where this green dot is in the dark part of the bar. The change model and the logic of the simulation says it would have been ideal to do that step in this range. Here's an example where this green dot means it would have been better to do a certain step earlier rather than later. And there's really interesting logic here. There's not a single path to project success. I think that's very realistic. There's some, if you will, fuzzy logic that allows people to take different paths to success. And you can still learn from the hiccups and the things that you might have hoped to do better along the way in the simulation. So I hope at least this brief view gives you a glance, and from the pictures you can sort of envision teams of people in a workshop working together. You can say the teams are competing against each other, but really the key is that they're learning and practicing that model for change through the simulation. And we go back and forth between small team activities and larger group discussion and debrief. So I think that idea of reflection is very powerful, not just in the workshop, but hopefully the next night people sleep on it, think about the simulation, think about what they're going to do with change in the workplace. This idea of experience plus reflection equals growth. I think that's a really powerful idea, not just to go and do stuff, but to do stuff and learn from it and reflect about it. And the final thought, and the feedback we've heard about the simulation, people have said this is like getting a whole year's worth of change management experience in just one day. I think that's very powerful. If we make mistakes, it's just a simulation, and we learn from it. We haven't caused any harm in the organization. So that's the overview that I wanted to give today. I would invite any of you, if you would like to do maybe a more detailed demo or discussion about potentially bringing this to your organization. I would love to come and facilitate this with you to talk about how to incorporate it into different change initiatives that are planned or ongoing. I think this is a great learning experience, but it's also a matter of having the discussion about how this can be helpful, the right timing and the right context to do a simulation like this. So again, you can learn more at experiencepoint.com. You can go to markgraban.com/EC, which stands for Experience Change. I would invite you, go to my blog. A couple of my blog posts this week have been related to this topic of change and buy-in. I'll send those out to people after the fact, and I would certainly invite you to reach out and ask any questions or let me know if you want to talk more about this via email. We've opened the invitation, I guess, to, please feel free to reach out to me via email, mark@markgraban.com. I would be more than happy to schedule a phone call or a web meeting to be able to explore this further and talk about how we can be helpful and how we can collaborate. Because again, I'll just kind of recap some of my initial comments. I think the power of lean, or the circumstances where people struggle with lean, it's not about the tactics and the tools. It's about the leadership, the change management, the things that are really complicated in an organization. It's easier to understand what lean is than it is to try to drive and affect change in complex, fast-moving organizations like hospitals and healthcare systems. So that's why I think this model is incredibly helpful. This is a great way to learn, and I hope we'll have an opportunity to collaborate somewhere in 2016. So again, this has been Mark Graban. Thank you for being part of the webinar today.